Good evening. Good evening and, oh, thank you. How nice. Good evening and welcome. My name is Andrew Westover, and I'm the Eleanor MacDonald Storza Director of Education here at the High Museum of Art. Thank you for joining us. You may notice the yellow letters that are projected on the screen behind me. This is a live captioning service. A person in another room is listening to the sound the microphones pick up and then transcribing the sound into text. I hope you find this service useful. And should the captioner incorrectly type an unfamiliar word or phrase during this program, I encourage you also to lend them a bit of grace. This program is in conjunction with our current exhibition, George Voronovsky Memoryscapes, which was organized here at the High Museum of Art. This exhibition was made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines Incorporated, the ACT Foundation, William N. Banks Jr., the Cousins Foundation, Burton M. Gold, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Harry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, and Benefactor Exhibition Series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. I want to thank all of the High Museum members who are in attendance. Your support is invaluable to fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. And I'd like to thank High Museum staff members Noah Schmitz, Kyle Mancuso, John Voorhees, and the full High team for their essential support in making this program happen. And now, I am glad to turn the program over to Dr. Katherine Jentleson, the High's Merrie and Dan Boone Curator of Folk and Self-Taught Art, who will frame this evening's conversation and introduce our honored guest.
Okay, good evening. It's my turn to say that. Thank you, Andrew, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We've remarked that for a beautiful early summer night in Atlanta, this is an excellent crowd. We appreciate your foregoing the outdoors to come learn tonight and think about the power of art. So on stage tonight, I'm joined by Peter Doroshenko, who is the director of the Ukrainian Museum in New York. Over the past 35 years, he's organized over 200 exhibitions, including shows for many Ukrainian artists, among them Ilya and Emilia Kabakov, Boris Mikolov, and Janet Sobel. Before coming to the Ukrainian Museum, he was the executive director at the Dallas Contemporary Art Museum for more than a decade, and he's also held leadership positions at other institutions like the Pinchik Art Center in Kyiv. He's lectured and taught at postgraduate programs, including Core Program Houston, Le Pavillon Palais de Tokyo, Paris, De Atelier Amsterdam, and the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York. In early March 2022, with the invasion of Ukraine, Doroshenko worked with Christie's to create a major auction of both international and Ukrainian artists, which raised $408,000 for Doctors Without Borders and their medical efforts in Ukraine. And among the things we'll talk about tonight are the incredible work that he's doing, beyond typical museum functions of displaying art, and really doing a lot to think about cultural preservation and how to help Ukraine in crisis. So one logistical note before we begin is that if there's time, we will have a Q&A, and so just hold your questions till the end. And when you have a question, when that time comes, please raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so that the whole audience can hear your question as you pose it. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Peter Doroshenko. We're also going to do our best to hold our microphones close tonight. I've been given that important feedback from audience members in some of my previous events. So Our first where I wanted to start our conversation, Peter, is with the Ukrainian Museum, because I'm not sure how many folks have spent time there, know much about the institution and its history and the neighborhood that it is a part of. So could you tell us a little bit about the museum where you are currently the director and what you're doing there?
Good evening. Yes, absolutely. The Ukrainian Museum in New York has been in existence since 1977, so going on soon close to 50 years. It was started by a women's organization, which has been in existence for over 80 years here in the United States. And during the Chicago World's Fair in 1938, there was a pavilion of Ukrainian kind of arts and crafts. And they purchased those objects, which was the basis of the museum. It was stored in a brownstone walk-up on 2nd Avenue in the Ukrainian neighborhood, which is in the East Village, which is 2nd Avenue, and kind of St. Mark's is kind of the epicenter. And then they started, just like a lot of museums, a lot of organizations, it started kind of as a club, and then it emerged and became a little bit more serious and more serious, and then really kind of created a charter to exist as a non-for-profit museum and to kind of exhibit and have a mission about celebrating what Ukrainian culture is. In the late 1990s, they obviously outgrew that facility, the walk-up. They had 2 floors in that building, but the storage was inadequate. Everything was off-site in New Jersey and another state across the river, and they decided to build a building. So they started in the late 1990s, gathering and fundraising, completely community-based, and really going after small donations, and I'm talking $25, $50, along to industrialists and people with Ukrainian backgrounds who had the financial flexibility to give larger donations. And they raised over $12 million. So they purchased land in the neighborhood, which is on 6th Street between 2nd Avenue and Bowery, and built a museum, a 4-story building. We house our collection completely there. We do temporary exhibitions, and I started there a little bit over a year ago to kind of expand both the programming gamut, but also to shepherd along other ideas, be it contemporary or neighborhood based. So that way, the world has changed, obviously, in more than the last year and a half. Ukraine has changed. And so it's really how the board were very keen on kind of tying all these things together and to work together for new directions, new ideas. And so that's kind of where we are today.
So, you really came into this role at a critical moment in the history of Ukraine, and you're doing so much more than just temporary exhibitions. Like, that's of course the kind of central program, and as you mentioned, there's a permanent collection as well. I got to see some things you had on display at the museum in March, but what you're doing now really kind of again goes beyond the scope of what's typical for a museum. And so I'm talking about things like this program, which I was hoping you could tell a little bit about its origins, how it's been evolving, and what kinds of conversations you're having right now.
Yes. When I started last June, they promised me there were shows lined up, and I said, great. They told me the names. I'm like, great. And adjunct or freelance curators doing the exhibitions. Fantastic. I don't know them personally, but I think they're going to do a great job from the history that I've seen or heard of their activities. Well, none of that was true. And so I started, and there were no exhibits in September. And I thought, oh my God. And so I started working on an exhibit called Impact Damage. And I reinstalled our collection, which goes from recent contemporary works all the way until, I would say, ceramics from the 17th century. There's other things in the collection, but I kind of held it together where it would be a generic or anywhere in a small town museum, which now the Russians, of course, are pillaging. So I created this context of visiting an imaginary museum, but the difference is that all the lights were shut off. So when you came into the gallery, there were only 3 light sources, and there were 3 video projectors, there's an organization since the war started called Babylon 13, and it's 100 movie directors who got together, because obviously they're not going to make romance films right now. So they got together to document, both in video and in film, the atrocities that are happening in the country. And so I talked to them via Zoom. They actually created 3 themes, which they were working on already, and one was immigration, one was the front, and the other was pain. And so I projected right on the artwork, be it a canvas or a historical blouse or ceramic work or whatever it may be. Those were the only light sources. And our galleries are not huge, but they're also not small. We're a medium-sized museum. So the footprint of our main gallery is about just a little over 5,000 square feet. So it did get dark in many different places. And of course, people came in and it was like shocked. But then they got it, that, at that time, power was being targeted by Russian drones. There was no power. All museums in Ukraine at that time were closed. Most of them still are. So it was a very emotional kind of a situation. You also, I'm over 60, and I should have already known, but you need to be careful what you wish for. So I wrote to the ambassador in Washington, D.C., that I wanted the president to open the exhibit, because I knew he would be possibly coming to the United Nations in September. They wrote back, no, the president's not coming, but the president's sending his wife. So she actually opened that exhibit, which was kind of amazing. And something else that we started in a big way when I started, and I already had a little bit of heads up, so even before coming in the door, I already started working on it, is a program called SAFE, and that's what you see off the website here, and that's called Safeguarding Ukrainian Culture. And Olena Zelenska, the First Lady, talked about their efforts, and what it really is the museum collects both from members, from foundations, from corporations in New York. We're a kind of a mediator in sending funds, substantial funds, for supporting organizations in Ukraine. Because at first, when I started there, people needed laptop computers, then they needed cloud services, then they needed packing materials, but luckily a lot of the European partners, such as UNESCO, the European Union, came in with major funds to cover those kind of short-term needs. So we kind of pivoted and started giving to a variety, both large, medium, and small organizations that had people on the ground actually making significant impact on destroyed museums, cultural heritage sites that were bombed, mosaics on the side of public buildings that were desecrated or destroyed. So we've been doing that consistently, and then networking with as many of those organizations as possible. and along with organizations in New York and across the country, such as the 9/11 Museum. And we've funded through our program Ukrainian museum directors and cultural organization leaders to talk with colleagues in New York and across the country via Zoom on getting feedback, ideas, and the program's also expanded where we're doing a lot on decolonization of Russia, and that could be as simple as a wall label at a museum where, Kazimir Malevich, born, raised in Ukraine, went to school in Ukraine, but is now Russian somehow. So we're making changes in that process, helping museums to understand he lived in Russia, but doesn't make you Russian. And along with really helping certain organizations out with legal issues, and that's a repatriation of objects that have slowly been disappearing out of the country. So it's an unusual program, and lastly, we just started, I have no idea how far this will go, is so many museums are being emptied by the Russian army, and it's in the news constantly, every city. These poor people, if those cities do get liberated, there's going to be nothing in the museums. So we're in the process of contacting them and figuring out what can we send from our collection for X number of years, probably 10, 15 years, to cover bases so that way people can actually go see something in the museum. Because it's not like museums are going to start sharing things. They will to a certain extent, but not to the needs that will be necessary. Sorry about the long answer.
No, it's fascinating, and I want to keep the spotlight on you and your path to the Ukrainian Museum for a moment, just because for you it's a personal path too, and I was wondering if you would tell a little bit about your journey as a curator into leadership roles and also your own backgrounds. Growing up in a Ukrainian community in Chicago?
Yes, I grew up in the Ukrainian community in Chicago, and I went to kindergarten and didn't know a word of English. That's how tight-knit some of these communities are. And it's not just Ukrainian, same could be for Polish and Lithuanian and whatnot. And I recently found out that I was not unique, that the artist Peter Hujar experienced the same thing, where he was homeschooled in his grandparents in western New Jersey, and when his grandmother passed, grandfather sent him back to the mother, and age 8, he didn't know a word of English. And that's a little bit of a starting point. So it was always there, the Ukrainian component. Also, just like in the last 300, 400 years, my mother was, into embroidery, making Easter eggs. This whole aspect of village arts and crafts was always in the home. And it's in most homes, which is really unusual. And it can go from traditional arts and crafts to songs, to singing, whatnot. And when I entered college, of course, I was super into everything that the world had to offer, not so much Ukrainian, until being a curator in Houston in the early 90s, the wall came down, and I got a call from somebody at the State Department and said, "Oh, we're organizing an Andy Warhol show, and we've selected you to go and lecture about that show." I said, "Great, where am I going?" And he said, "We're going to send you to Ukraine." And I thought, wow, that's pretty unusual. And they said, "Well, you're the person who can do it." So I went a few times, and not just Warhol. There were other exhibitions that the State Department did put together with other foundations, the Renaissance Foundation in Kiev, and that's how it all started. And through my career, I've always included Ukrainian artists when it was appropriate or something interesting was happening. And when I was the director at the Baltic Center for Contemporary Art, which is the second largest contemporary art organization and museum in the United Kingdom, I was in New York at an art fair, and two really big guys came up to me with really bad accents saying, "Are you Peter Doroshenko?" I said, "Yes, I am. Victor Pinchuk, a collector in Kiev, wants to talk to you." I thought, wow. So I had dinner with this gentleman. I already knew that he was interested in collecting. He already had a Ukrainian landscape collection. But he really wanted to push contemporary, something he didn't know about. So I agreed to help him organize and open a contemporary museum in Kiev while still being a director of the second largest contemporary art space in the United Kingdom. So that was quite a learning experience, but it was a great learning experience on starting with a blank sheet of paper and what an organization needs. And it worked quite successfully to the point of him saying, "Why don't you come full time here to work in Kiev?" which I did. And it was an amazing experience. It was a kind of almost a free-for-all, a Wild West in terms of an emerging market. People super excited, young people wanting to learn more and more about Western contemporary art, going beyond the internet, seeing and meeting artists in person. So it was really kind of a very unique situation. And then in the same, even a better offer was made in Dallas, and I just kind of then moved on where, I did amazing exhibitions, with artists such as Eric Fischel, Julian Schnabel, Atlanta's very own. My last exhibition was Lonnie Holly, but I did pepper it in with either video artists or film directors who were in Ukraine doing interesting things. So it's always been there.
So speaking of learning experiences, this show for me, the George Voronovsky show, has been a major learning experience because it's, for me, learning about the history of Ukraine, the personal history of an artist who shared a trajectory with, so many people who became refugees of World War II and ended up in the United States. But these were histories that I was really unfamiliar with prior to working on this exhibition. And George Voronovsky, for those of you who haven't gotten to see the exhibition yet, is an artist who has never had a significant exhibition of his work. So his presentation of his work is really the first time that his art has been seen in a public way, and in a kind of critical mass, and also in a presentation that really delves into his history and the meaning of his works. And so I'm showing you a couple of installation shots on the screen there. And so his story is that he was born in Gallipoli in 1903. And like I said, he was one of, hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced by World War II. He was not Jewish. He wasn't put in a concentration camp when the Nazis invaded Ukraine in 1941, but he was among, thousands of Ukrainians who were sent to forced labor camps. And so he was separated from his family in 1944. He had 2 children, and really never saw them again. They stayed in Prague. They stayed in Prague after the war, and he ended up in East Germany and then working as a musician. He was a classically trained musician, and he started playing in displaced persons camps after the war. And then in 1951 comes to the United States, and this is a moment 3 years after the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed many, many refugees to finally enter the United States and settle here. He came through New York, through Ellis Island, and then ended up in Philadelphia. But gradually, he made his way by 1972 to South Beach, Miami. And Peter, you have experience with South Beach, kind of not exactly of that moment, but pretty close to it. And so George ended up in this hotel, which you can see right here, the Colony Hotel, which was right on the beach. and you have some personal memories. I was hoping you would share of what that, because when we think of South Beach now, we think of it as being this like glitzy, place where obviously there's so much money pouring into it. There's major art world events like Art Basel Miami, but this was a different era of South Beach, and you experienced it firsthand.
Yes, my parents discovered it on their own, and we always went there on holiday. And it was a very different Miami Beach. It was a Miami Beach where everybody was over 80, and it was very seedy, like really seedy. And I think my parents enjoyed it because they were paying next to nothing to be on the ocean and in a hotel, which was nothing special, literally 4 or 5 hotels down from where George stayed at the Colony. But it was actually one of the great memories because my parents at that point felt, even though we're from Chicago, felt really at ease for me and my sister to run around. We didn't, they did not helicopter over us. We did our own thing. And I think it was because, once again, everybody was very old or kind of, seedy looking. And so it was great. We went year after year. But obviously that has all changed a lot. But it was quite interesting when I was reading about George that that he lived there, and I thought, well, of course, yeah, why not? Mm-hmm. Because it was so inexpensive. I mean, and he was probably paying just a few dollars a day to live in a place right on the ocean.
Exactly, and he was living in the 3rd floor of the Colony Hotel, and there was many pedestrians would pass by, and one day in 1978, a pedestrian named Gary Monroe passed by and looked up and saw that there was something kind of sparkling in the window of this 3rd floor room. He saw all these ornaments that were hanging and kind of dangling and making sounds. And he knew somebody else who lived there because he was a photographer who had been photographing this elder community that had come to South Beach, especially in the kind of post-war era. And so he got to know George, and George became a kind of surrogate father to him. He became like a surrogate son to George, and got to know this amazing world that George created through his paintings. And so our exhibition is predominantly paintings like the one that you see on the screen now. George loved birds. He loved migrating animals in general, but I think birds had this kind of special importance to him because of the kind of ubiquity that they were always present in his life, no matter whether he was outside in the yard of a labor camp in East Germany or whether he was sitting on the beach like he is here, a free man, looking up into the sky and enjoying the beauty of Miami Beach. So to me, I think birds became this kind of these animals that he could recognize, these kind of companions that he could project onto, and they also are remarkable for their ability to travel great distances together, right? Through their seasonal migrations, through these incredible formations that they make in the sky. And sadly, that was obviously something that eluded George, who was forcibly displaced from his homeland, couldn't return for reasons that we don't totally have clarity on, but certainly many, many folks who made the choice or were forced to desert the Soviet army during World War II became enemies of the state. And we suspect that was the case with him. And through his paintings, which were on all different kinds of surfaces, canvas board, cardboard, he was recreating these beautiful scenes. And the more that we did research into this exhibition, the more that we understood these weren't purely sparks from his imagination that were gaining momentum and becoming real. These were memoryscapes, which is what we call the exhibition. And so, and the more that I pass through the show, especially with people who are of Ukrainian heritage, the more I come to understand about what George was depicting. So this piece, for instance, which is kind of a favorite within the museum, we discovered recently from friends some of them are based here in Atlanta and who are Ukrainian, that this is Ivana Kupala. This is this solstice celebration that is coming up in a few weeks, and The women in these diaphanous dresses are carrying wreaths that are made during the celebration and worn during the celebration. The kind of fiery mountains in the distance may signify this ritual of jumping over bonfires that's part of that celebration. And so all to say that George was really kind of reconnecting, with his homeland, with this place that he loved, and finding ways to kind of live it again through his artwork. And he also was filling his work with all kinds of folk tales and folk references. This is a really fun story about an older man who can't pull this giant turnip out of the ground, and so has to call upon his wife and their children, and their children's children, and eventually the animals, and they do get the turnip out of the ground. And this is a folk tale that's, it's broadly Slavic and certainly told within Ukrainian context, including by Maria Premachenko, whose painting is here. This, what I'm showing you, is a kind of panel that we have throughout the exhibition that really, we hope, is helping visitors look at his work and then look at these historical images and understand again that he was painting his experience. He wasn't just painting his imagination or fantasy. He was painting memories, he was painting traditions, he was painting all kinds of things that really were part of his life. And so Maria Premachenko is somebody who Peter's actually organizing a show about, and she's been in the news a lot, so we wanted to spend some time talking about her art and her legacy.
Most of you, when the war started last year, I think it was less than 2 weeks in, probably saw in the news there was a very small museum just outside of Kyiv, which was a hotbed for those first few weeks of the war, and it held a small collection, about 20, 30 works of Maria Premachenko, who's kind of the heroine or the 20th century lead female artist of Ukraine. And the roof, they blew off the roof. 4 works were damaged or burned in that action. I think a neighbor next to the museum single-handedly was able to get the other 14 works out. But it really catapulted her name into Western media. And with Maria, she had a traditional, somewhat of a traditional outsider artist upbringing, where she did a lot. She taught herself how to paint, but then she did go for 8 months to the Folk Art Museum in the Pecheska Lavra, which is the most important monastery on the Dnipro River in Kyiv. And there's a museum there with the National Traditional Arts and Crafts, and they had a school at that time. So she went and kind of had her own little studio and attended certain classes. So she did have that particular training. At this point, she did get polio and was dealing with that for the rest of her life. She also did meet her husband, who went off to the war, never came back, and then later moved back to the village where she was from, which is literally like 38, 40 miles outside of Kyiv, and just stayed there for the rest of her life. And just like many of these outsider artists, she found happiness in making art. And if she wasn't making art, she was unhappy. And so it was the kind of thing where, just like, once again, other outsider artists that had children, the children somehow got looped into the parents' creativity or their creative endeavors. And so Maria's child, her son, was basically her studio assistant, right? Her whole life. And so there's a lot of these kind of connections with George and Maria Premachenko, and later I'll speak about Janet Sobel, where it's there. The difference with, what I'll end with Maria Premachenko is, you have to also realize that every artist, every theoretician, writer, academic, at this point in the war or in the 1950s, was either sent to a gulag or killed. End of story. And then those that, most recently I found out that even Malevich was tortured, and because of that torture died of cancer. Which, once again, we can pick up 100 books on Malevich, it's never going to be mentioned. So she was super subversive in her art making, not necessarily with the images that we're showing here, but in organizing the exhibit, I was in Kiev about 2 months ago, and I was actually shocked where I went back to my hotel room shaking, because she started incorporating communist leaders in a very non-polite manner as animals. I saw Lenin, I saw Stalin with a little goatee, wearing the same hat, but as a pig. And, I just thought, wow, she was really walking the tightrope there. Because if anybody really looked at that work and put two and two together, she would have been hauled off the next day. But she kept doing it and doing it and doing it until the wall came down, and still lived an additional 7.5 years after that. So she was super subversive and always included this political kind of angle very quietly, very subversively. Once again, I don't know, and only people who were living through those times would know city council people or the deputy mayor or blah, blah. But I think all of those people, whoever was involved in government or made certain kind of judgments or pushed certain levers in the community, became these beasts or animals in her works. And this is something that I'm working with an essayist. We're opening the show in October. And I'm working with the essayist who's writing a very lengthy, kind of a different perspective of her works, because she also did ceramics, she did embroidery, she covered the whole gamut, even learned photography from her neighbor her last 2 years. And so we're examining that kind of subversive component in her work.
And you have another show that's open currently, and I should say that we probably need to start to wrap things up to allow time for questions, but of an artist you mentioned, Janet Sobel.
Yes, this exhibit just opened in April, and this is something that also, it's like my life. So I moved back from Kiev to Dallas, and I have a meeting with a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And she goes, let's go to the library. It's going to be nice and quiet there. We can talk all we want. Nobody's scheduled there. So I go in, and I see an abstract work, and I come up, and I go, wow, that's really amazing work. It almost looks like Jackson Pollock. And it was Janet Sobel. And then the label said, Ukrainian. I'm like, what? I just moved 3 months ago from Ukraine. I've never heard of this person. So, I went back, started researching things on my own, and have been doing that, since that time, since 2010. And when I got the job in New York, I decided, okay, I have to do this exhibit. So it was not an easy endeavor, because much like a lot of these artists, she came into a spotlight. She only started making art at age 47, mother of 5, living in Brighton Beach, which is not like an artist hub. It's not where you go if you want to be famous. But believe it or not, she was rubbing shoulders with, Gertrude Whitney, Peggy Guggenheim included her in exhibitions in her gallery. She became so famous that even the Roosevelts invited her to the White House for tea. And but she was doing it for herself, She also did make paintings. She made the first drip paintings. which a year later, all of a sudden, Jackson Pollock started making drip paintings. And because he was a man and championed by the male critics at the time in New York, his career flourished, whereas her career kind of was still there. I mean, she was president. And a lot of people think that somehow that discouraged her from making more art and she kind of faded away. Well, actually, no, because her husband and his brothers opened a plastic bead factory to make jewelry, and she was very involved in that her whole time. Once again, very Ukrainian, making beads and various decorative things for costumes. And the business was doing so well that she had to give up art to become a vice president to run the family business. So, she became a capitalist. And it wasn't about the art or about Jackson Pollock. And so, and that's something, actually we have a publication coming out, but you learn so much, I'm sure, as you did with George's exhibit, certain things that just haven't even been discussed or thought about. And Sobel is definitely one of those exhibits.
Absolutely. And I mean, we had to take advantage of Peter's knowledge and familiarity with so many artists who are new to us. So maybe if we could just briefly talk about Emma and
yes, this is the work by Emma Andriavska, who is originally from Donetsk. During World War II, she immigrated to Munich. Her family, as once again forced labor. She stayed in Munich after the war. She's a poet. She believes she's still alive, 93 years old, 94. Has always been making work. Very colorful, has created her own world. Obviously, she's looked at other artists because they're all there. Very influenced by surrealism. We had an exhibit of her work last fall. And there are a lot of artists who were born in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and they all overlap. I think Emma Andrievska, the last one we just showed, was born in the early 20s, but everybody else, they were almost of the same generation.
And so these were all really kind of peers of George Voronovsky's, whether he probably only knew about Maria Premachenko.
Exactly.
Exactly. But it's again interesting once you start to kind of peel the onion on just how many important Ukrainian artists there are from the 20th century, and especially who were more or less self-taught.
Correct.
It's pretty remarkable. And this is an artist who, Nicofor, who was on view at the museum earlier this spring, and I got to see, and I'll just briefly say that, well, can you say something about his materials and what he was working from?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was, once again, a self-taught artist. He pretty much lived on the street most of the time, not always, but most of the time. He would go into church, steal papers there, notes. He'd rummage through garbage to find paper, and he was possessed. If he didn't make a drawing, and sometimes he'd make hundreds a day, and most of them are very small, notebook size. He would have mental breakdowns, and so he was sent obviously to psychological clinics many times. People were afraid of him, but yet at the same time he was always there, painting the same small little city, which was actually very touristy because it was somewhere where Poles would go to spa for the healing waters. And there were the same churches, the same buildings. He would just keep drawing them over and over, repeating them, going into the churches, drawing the saints on the walls. I read a funny story where he was once just sitting up against a church making drawings and had a cup, and a woman gave him some money, and he gave her one or two drawings. She passed the trash can and threw the drawings into the trash. And so he was obviously not taken very serious because he made thousands of drawings, and there are actually very few left. I mean, there's still a lot, but not thousands. And so he was just not taken seriously during his time. And then a lot of it also had to do with, he's from Lemko, which is a province next to Ukraine. It was part of Ukraine at one point, but then the borders changed many times over the last 300 years. And so they speak Ukrainian with a very unusual accent and dialect, and they don't speak Polish. So the Ukrainians are weary of them, and the Polish do not like them. And so it's like a real weird, I guess it's like Catalonia in Spain, where they have their own kind of language, their own kind of mini culture happening in their own particular neighborhood or in their own kind of province. And it really seeps out in Nicofor's work.
Absolutely. And it's, to me, when I saw Nicofor's work, it was remarkable. Something that both he and George Voronovsky shared is this ability to completely transform these humble materials, right? So this is a painting that George made on a Pizza Hut box. Most of his paintings are on found cardboard like that. And not just the ability to kind of render that kind of very humble substrate something gorgeous, but the surface quality of both of their works is just extraordinary. So I really hope that you all, if you haven't seen the George Voronovsky show in person, will make time to check it out before it closes in August, because you have to see these works in person to really appreciate their splendor. And then please, the next time that you're in New York, put Ukrainian Museum on your itinerary, because Peter has so many amazing exhibitions coming up. I'm going to kind of close us out there so that we can open up to hear from you all and what you're wondering about, and welcome your questions. Thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I will bring the mic around. First come, first serve. So feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions.
Can you tell us if there's an increased interest in visiting your museum? Has the attendance gone up significantly in the last year or so?
Yes. Before I started, there was a major spike in attendance because people just were, I think, curious, confused. They wanted to ground what they're seeing in the news. So there was, I would say, since March or April of last year, it's been slowly, going down with peaks when we open exhibits, much like all museums. I mean, you have peaks and then it kind of drops. So we're slowly getting back into what it was pre-COVID. What has changed since the war is right now we have Janet Sobel, and then Lesia Khumenko is a contemporary artist from Ukraine, who's basically living in New York because she had to escape with her daughter. And so we have her exhibit upstairs, and then some of our collection on a lower concourse level. But a lot of people expect to see this or that from our collection. Of course, we're not that large. No museum can show its whole collection. So I'd say the only difference is certain people want to come to the museum to see the Easter eggs, or the Ukrainian blouses, or this. And it may or may not be there because obviously we have a whole program in line, and that's a battle I think we'll keep fighting for a while.
You mentioned earlier a pedestrian walking by and looking up and seeing shiny things. Do I remember seeing mobiles in the exhibit of Voronovsky?
We don't have any hanging mobiles in the show. The only objects that I think still exist that are on string are marionettes that he made out of palm fronds, which we didn't include in the exhibition, although I wish they're fantastic. What we do have on view are the kind of flowers, or maybe you could see them as suns that he carved from food cans, like drink containers and other kinds of food cans. And those were part of mobiles that hung in his window. So there's kind of parts of the things that he hung throughout his room, but nothing that's actually still like hanging on its original thread or string. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both for tonight. I actually have two questions, if you'll entertain both. The first is you've mentioned that other artists from Ukraine have used kind of that platform as political commentary in some instances. George's work in the gallery doesn't show that specifically to Merrie. Is it known, though, from his life once he immigrated due to the political circumstances of his time? Was he very critical or outspoken about the situation in his home country after immigrating? And then a second question, a little simpler. You've mentioned in your youth and growing up in your Ukrainian neighborhood, as well as displayed on one of the earlier photos of the museum, there's a long tradition of egg decoration. If you could describe the origin of that long-going tradition.
So to the first question, I don't know that he was at all, a part of any kind of political organizations or vocal about opposition to the situation that he left behind in Europe. I think that probably to the contrary, he was wanting to fly under the radar, and I think that, for me, and we talked about this earlier, but didn't really get a chance to talk about it in our discussion, just the act of like holding on to memory and reanimating, a life that he was forced to leave behind through his art, like that's an act of political will, even if he wasn't doing caricatures of, communist leaders or that sort of thing. It's just, to hold on and nurture that part of yourself that that you've lost is something that I think is political, and that's true for a lot of self-taught artists that I've worked with here at the museum. Is that just the mere act of making, especially when you come from a marginalized position, whether it's because of race or you're an immigrant or all of these different kinds of identities that self-taught artists so often hold, just the even act of being visible and like making your experience known is political, right? Because you're somebody who's kind of been undermined and been, in George's case, forcibly displaced and imprisoned at various points of his life. So to me, though there isn't that kind of overt political message of being, really revolting against communism and his experience of it throughout his life, or Nazism, it's still there. Like it's still there in his kind of will to create, which is kind of part of what we titled the program.
And then with the eggs, they're called Premachenko, and they come out of a pagan tradition, which was usually celebrated, well, it was celebrated in the spring for birth, rebirth, very landscape-based, and a lot of these artists are also landscape-based. So a lot of the symbols, each egg has different symbols. Some are just made up. I mean, especially the contemporary ones. But there is a core of symbols that are used, and a lot of them are very simple: a sun, a leaf, basic things like that. But this is something that almost every family does with the Ukrainian background. You do it a week or two before Easter, and usually the moms are really good at it because they've been doing it longer, and the children get upset because they're not very good because they haven't practiced. But it's something that's kind of built in and has been built in for quite a long time. And this, keeps coming up. I mean, with George's work, and once again, I was reading Kazimir Malevich's his autobiography. There's 3 sections. And I was just reading the last one, which he put out like a year before his death. And he's just constantly talking about, abstraction, but not the abstraction that we know from the contemporary, the modern works here. He's talking about abstraction. His mother and his aunts, in a traditional Ukrainian home, there's like a giant white wall with the oven there where you bake the bread and put the food in. And of course you're not going to have a white wall, so the mother and the aunts drew butterflies and grass and leaves and blah blah. For Malevich, that was the beginning of abstract art. Once again, you're not going to read that in the last 8 books on Malevich, or but he says it out loud that the landscape was extremely important. So circling back to the Easter egg, it all comes out of the landscape. It all comes out of a lot of these things that are pagan traditions. It's the kind of things that are celebrated in every Ukrainian home. And actually, if you go to somebody's home and they don't have an Easter egg, or at least dye some eggs, that's the first thing you're going to hear about. Like, I am so sorry. You're going to hate me, but I don't have any. And so that's how deep-rooted it is.
And I just wanted to point out that this form in this kind of fireworks scene that Voronovsky did is a Pazenska. Like, that's the top of an egg. That's the kind of, and even like the whole horizon, the whole night sky filled with those fireworks and those motifs. Those are the kinds of motifs that you would see on that kind of folk craft.
We have time for one more.
Thanks for your conversation. One thing I wanted to ask about is, I know in the gallery there's photographs of George's studio, and it's like full ceiling to floor with his art. And I just wanted to see what you knew about, I guess, like how much work he actually made, how much of it is preserved, and the journey from, I guess, like his studio to this gallery.
Yeah, so he created, so the photographs show like single walls, but the room that he lived in was tiny. Like it was a studio, and so probably like 500 square feet. And so it seems like there's a ton of stuff, but it's actually a very small space, right? And the majority of it has been preserved by the photographer who became like a son to him, who kind of discovers him in the last 4 years of his life, and is the one who contacted the museum and said, I have this whole kind of trove of artwork that I've been hanging on to the past 40 years, never really known what to do with it. This person is really important to me. I think he's an amazing artist. Would you be interested in doing a show? And it took a while, but the answer ultimately became yes. But what we have in our galleries is like probably a quarter of what exists. And the rest is still in Florida in a storage facility. I mentioned like the marionettes, which I loved, but those were for the space that we have. Like the amount of space they would require to hang safely didn't make sense. So as a curator, you have to make those kinds of decisions, which aren't always fun or just logistical. But there are many more paintings. There are tons more styrofoam sculptures, and then these other kinds of things that he made that are kind of even outside of those two categorizations. So we're lucky that the person who kind of inherited this art, who at the time was a very young photographer, like he was like 22 or 23, was a photographer because he understood how you have to store things that are light sensitive, that really can't deal with lots of climate changes, and especially in a place like Florida, that's like a really important thing to know. And so because Gary was already kind of creating spaces to preserve his own photographic archive, which is actually going to the Rose Library at Emory University, he understood how to safely preserve this work. But it really hasn't been shown in any significant way since it was on view in George's Colony Hotel room. And then the thing I didn't say, but he actually, at the very end of his life, he had to move into like an assisted living facility, and he only would move on the condition that he could completely reconstruct the environment there. So he did. And this was like when he was obviously, unwell, but he managed to do, so the video that we have in the galleries where it's showing scenes from inside where he's living, that's actually the second place he lived. So he did manage to kind of completely reconstruct this holistic experience of his art.
Thank you so much, Peter and Katie. What a wonderful conversation. And thank you all for being here. We are out of time for questions, but please stick around for a few minutes and speak to our guest if you have the time. And we will see you all next time you come. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.